You held the tin ladle while she skimmed boiling cane, and when she tapped it twice against the rim and nodded, you knew it was ready without being told. That kind of knowing never made it into a book. Here are 30 soul food secrets from the 1920s that were actually banned. Before anyone called it a crime, there was a kitchen in Harlem where a woman boiled pig feet in a pot so big it took up half the stove. Pig feet were the centerpiece of rent parties, illegal apartment gatherings where tenants charged a quarter at the door and served plates alongside bootleg gin just to make rent. Langston Hughes saved hand-printed party tickets in a red box. The feet simmered for hours in vinegar, onion, garlic, and crushed red pepper until the cartilage turned to silk. They were served on wax paper with hot sauce, eaten standing up because the furniture was pushed against the walls for dancing. The Volstead Act made the gin illegal. Jim Crow made the gathering dangerous, but every Saturday night, those kitchens opened anyway, and the smell drifted through hallways where a fat swaller played piano for a plate and $1. Nobody throws those parties anymore. They will tell you Prohibition only banned drinking. They will not tell you it banned cooking. The Volstead Act turned grandmothers into criminals overnight. Peach brandy and cobbler was never about getting drunk. A tablespoon folded into the peaches with brown sugar and cinnamon before the batter went on top. It deepened the fruit, burned off mostly in the oven, and left a warmth that sugar alone could never give. Households hid brandy in medicine bottles, traded with neighbors who had working stills. Federal agents raided black homes at far higher rates than white ones. Historian Lisa McGurr documented the disproportionate enforcement of prohibition on African American communities, so the women baked quieter. When the last of the brandy ran dry, the cobbler still tasted good, but something underneath was gone. A depth, a heat, the ghost of a recipe nobody dared write down. In 1907, Alabama appointed its first game commissioner, and his opening argument was that black men who hunted did not work hard enough on tenant farms. That was the real reason behind the hunting laws, not conservation, but control. Possum roast suppers had been tradition in black households since before emancipation, rooted in West African practices of using every protein the land offered. The possum was soaked overnight in salted water, then slow roasted with sweet potatoes until the fat rendered down and the meat fell apart. People gathered on autumn nights, the smell drifting across cotton fields. But the new laws required licenses that cost money sharecroppers did not have, and wardens arrested black men caught hunting after dark. The suppers grew quieter, the hunts moved deeper into woods where no warden walked, and as folks migrated north to cities with no possums, no pits, no autumn nights smelling like roasting fat, the tradition slipped away, not because anyone chose to leave it, but because the law made keeping it too costly. You could always tell which smokehouse had a corn liquor ham inside because the air smelled different, sweeter, sharper, like wood smoke, and something forbidden underneath. Corn liquor cured ham was the oldest preservation secret in the rural black South, passed between households that understood moonshine was not just for drinking. The ham was rubbed with salt, brown sugar, and red pepper, then mopped with corn liquor before hanging in the smokehouse for weeks. The alcohol drew moisture out while the sugar and smoke sealed the outside, a flavor no store-bought cure could match. When Prohibition made distilling a federal crime, every smokehouse became evidence. Agents and sheriffs, sometimes working alongside Klan-affiliated enforcement leagues, targeted black farms first. The hams vanished from their hooks. The stills went deeper into the hollows. and a preservation method older than the country that banned it slowly went silent. Long before the smokehouse went quiet, there was a sound on the streets of New Orleans that meant breakfast, a woman's voice in French Creole calling out over a basket balanced on her head, hot rice fritters rising from a cold brazier. Callous were the original banned soul food. Deep-fried rice cakes made from leftover rice, flour, eggs, sugar, and nutmeg, sold by black women in the French Quarter since the 1700s, when the Code Noir gave enslaved women Sundays off to sell food and earn their own money. By the 1920s, vending ordinances pushed the women off the streets. The city wanted cleaner sidewalks. What it erased was a tradition connecting back to West African rice culture, the Wolof and Mandinka peoples who cultivated the grain that built Louisiana's economy. Rose Nicole, the most famous callus seller, purchased her freedom with fritter money earned outside Sunday Mass. By the 1930s, the challah women were gone. The sound went with them. The smell hit you before you saw the table. Sweet, sharp, slightly chemical, like summer fruit soaking in something your mother told you not to touch. Bathtub gin watermelon was the open secret of every rent party and backyard gathering in the 1920s. You cut a plug from a whole watermelon, poured in homemade gin until the fruit absorbed it, replaced the plug, and let it sit overnight. The gin seeped into the flesh, turning each bite cool and burning at the same time. You learned by watching your uncle work the knife on a Saturday afternoon while the yard filled with people who all knew the melon was not just melon. The gin was rough, juniper oil, and grain alcohol, but the fruit softened it, made it sweet enough to forget you were breaking. Two laws at once, possession and distribution. That was what they called sharing a slice with your neighbor. In the 1920s, when Southern game laws tightened on rural black communities, rabbit hunting moved to the dark hours. The stew was not fancy: quartered rabbit, browned in lard, simmered with onions, potatoes, and herbs that grew along the fence line. But it held defiance in every bite. Rabbits bred fast and lived everywhere, the most democratic protein in the South. A box trap from scrap wood and a handful of clover would do. But regulations required licenses, and in Alabama and Mississippi, wardens used those laws to control black movement off tenant farms. A man caught with a rabbit and no license could be jailed, which often meant convict labor. So the hunts moved to moonless nights, traps set where no warden walked. The women who cooked that stew never asked where the rabbit came from. They seasoned the pot and fed the household. That silence was his own kind of grace. When the first frost hit and the persimmons went soft on the branch, the brewing started. Persimmon beer was older than Prohibition, older than the country, rooted in indigenous American and West African fermentation traditions. Black families gathered the fruit after cold sweetened it, mashed it with wheat, bran, molasses, and water, then let it ferment in crocks until it turned fizzy and tart. The flavor was earthy, sweet, with a tang that caught the back of your throat. The Volstead Act banned beer production at home, even while allowing fruit wine. Persimmon beer fell on the wrong side of that line. What had been a seasonal ritual tied to the rhythm of the land became criminal overnight. Crocks got buried behind barns and hen houses. The recipe got whispered instead of spoken aloud. When the old ones who remembered the right ratio of fruit to grain finally passed on, nobody could ask them to say it one more time. The beer with them. She set up before dawn, oil heating in cast iron, cornmeal in a paper sack, catfish fillets on yesterday's newspaper. By the time the sun hit the porch, there would be a line. Selling fried fish from the front porch was how black women fed neighborhoods, and paid rent through the 1920s, where Jim Crow shut them out of wage work. 15 cents bought a plate, fish, coleslaw, cornbread, hot sauce. No license, no sign, just the smell pulling people from 3 blocks away. By mid-decade, cities like Philadelphia required vendors to obtain licenses and submit to inspections, with fines up to $50, a fortune for a woman earning pennies per plate. The rules landed hardest on Black women who had built entire economies from their kitchens. Some paid the fee and kept frying. Others moved indoors, sold quieter. The plates got smaller. The lines got shorter. One morning, the porch was just a porch again. If you did not grow up picking muscadines off the vine in late summer, you would never understand the wine. Thick, sweet, almost musky, with skin so tough you popped each grape between your teeth before the juice ran out. In Black households across the South, muscadine wine was as common as sweet tea. The grapes grew wild on fences from Virginia to Texas, and winemaking was simple: crushed grapes, sugar, water, time. No yeast needed because the wild bloom on the skins did the work. The Volstead Act permitted fruit wine at home, but enforcement was selective. Agents who let white folk press wine in California raided Black homes in Georgia over a single jug. So Muscadine moved to the back of the pantry. The jug got a label that said vinegar. Sunday dinner kept its sweetness quietly behind closed doors. And if Muscadine wine was the secret the pantry kept, turtle soup was the secret the creek kept. Freshwater turtles, snappers, sliders, soft shells were a primary protein for Black households in the rural South, caught by hand in creeks that had fed communities for generations. The soup was dark, built from turtle meat, simmered with tomatoes, onions, celery, and hard-boiled eggs. The meat had a texture like no other, tender but firm, somewhere between chicken and something wilder. As conservation boards expanded, waterway regulations restricted harvesting, and licensing followed the same pattern as the hunting laws. Wildlife management on paper, control of Black movement in practice. A man pulling a snapper from a creek on a white landowner's property faced trespassing and poaching charges both. The soup pots went cold. A dish that once anchored Saturday supper faded to memory. The crack of shell, the smell of broth, the weight of something wild becoming warm. On 142nd Street in Harlem, behind a door with no sign and a window painted black, a woman fried chicken while Duke Ellington played in the next room. Speakeasy fried chicken was the unofficial meal of the Harlem Renaissance, served at unlicensed clubs where Black musicians, writers, and porters gathered to eat in a city that charged them 30% more rent for existing. The chicken was dredged in seasoned flour, fried in lard until the crust shattered, and handed over in wax paper while you stood near the piano. Every piece of that meal was illegal: the gin, the food service, the gathering. Vice commissions used these spaces as pretexts to raid Black establishments while white clubs went untouched. In 1928, New York's Committee of 14 sent agents into Harlem to shut those doors for good. The skillets went cold, and the taste of chicken eaten standing in a room full of music that has no recipe because the ingredient was freedom. If Speakeasy chicken belonged to the city, Raccoon and sweet potato belonged to the country, and the country had its own laws to break. Raccoon had been survival food for Black households across the rural South for generations. The meat soaked overnight in salt water, then braised low and slow with sweet potatoes, onions, and whatever pepper grew near the porch until the fat melted into the dish and everything turned golden and rich. The animal was hunted at night with dogs. The the sound of their baying rolling across hollow and field. By the 1920s, game commissions required licenses for raccoon, and night hunting was banned outright in Georgia, the Carolinas, and most of the Deep South. A man caught without papers faced fines he could never pay or jail time that fed the convict lease system. The traps got smaller, the hunts went deeper, and a dish that once anchored cool weather suppers across the Black Belt became something people only whispered about making. Centuries before the Volstead Act, West African communities brewed beer from grain, millet, sorghum, corn, using open fermentation that turned simple ingredients into something alive. Enslaved Africans brought those traditions to the American South, and corn beer became a quiet staple in rural Black households. Cracked corn, water, a little molasses, left in a jug for days until it turned sour and fizzy, a low alcohol drink that tasted like the land itself. When Prohibition banned all beer production at home, even while allowing fruit wine, corn beer was criminalized overnight. A tradition with roots in the Yoruba and Akan peoples vanished from porches across the South. The old women who knew when the fermentation was ready, by the sound of the bubbles, the smell of the crock, stopped making it. Nobody learned to listen for those bubbles after they were gone. The brambles tore your arms raw, but you picked until the bucket was full because your grandmother said the wine would not taste right without the scratches. Blackberry wine was among the most common homemade wines in Black Southern families. Berries foraged along fence rows and creek banks. Crush them, add sugar, let the wild yeast on the skins work, strain through cheesecloth, and wait. The wine came out dark as ink, sweet, and so strong it made your eyes water. The Volstead Act technically allowed home fruit wine, but for Black folk in the rural South, technically legal meant nothing. Agents enforced selectively, and foraging was increasingly restricted as trespassing laws expanded. Linneken's research in the Fordham Urban Law Journal documented how these statutes targeted Black communities. The brambles still grew every July. The women who knew which patch made the sweetest wine stopped walking that far. Bobby Rush, who called himself king of the Chitlin circuit, once said that after a show in Argo, Illinois, the club owner paid him with 2 plates of chitlins and 4 hamburgers. He ate 1 plate and sold the rest for $1.35. That was the economy, a network of juke joints, churches, and backroom clubs where Black performers played for Black audiences because Jim Crow kept them off every other stage. The Theater Owners Booking Association, formed in 1921 to book acts like Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, though performers called it tough on Black artists. At every stop, food was part of the show. Chitlins, fried fish, pig feet, potato salad, sold from kitchens with no permits and no inspections. The venues operated outside city codes, but they were the only stages Black musicians had. When integration opened white clubs, the circuit faded, and with it, the kitchens that fed artists who played for the love and the plate. Your grandfather never called it Groundhog, he called it Whistle Pig, and he knew where every burro sat on the hillside above the tobacco field. Groundhog stew was Appalachian soul food, eaten by Black folk in the mountain communities of Virginia, West Virginia, and the Carolinas, where the animal was as common as squirrel and twice as fat. The meat was parboiled to pull the gaminess, then browned in lard and simmered slow with potatoes, wild onion, and a heavy hand of black pepper. It tasted dark and rich, like something the hill itself had made, but the same game laws that restricted rabbit hunting applied here. Licenses required, seasons enforced, trespassing charges for hunting on land your people had worked for decades. A Black man caught with a groundhog and no paperwork could lose a week's wages. The old man kept hunting anyway, checking burrows at dawn before the warden's truck came. When they passed, nobody remembered which hillside to check. In the 1920s, before fishing regulations reached the back creeks of Mississippi and Alabama, black men caught catfish with nothing but their hands. Noodling, reaching into underwater holes and grabbing the fish by the mouth when it bit down, was passed from father to son with deadly seriousness. You learned which holes held catfish by the color of the mud, the temperature of the water, the way the current moved around a submerged log. The catch came out fighting 30, 40 pounds of flathead, enough to feed a household for days. Fried in cornmeal over a fire on the bank, the fish was sweet and still warm from the river. But states began banning hand fishing in the early 20th century, classifying it as unsportsmanlike and harmful to spawning populations. Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri all passed laws against it, and southern states followed. The laws did not mention race, but the men who noodled were overwhelmingly poor, rural, and black, and the ban removed a free protein source that had sustained generations. The creek still ran. The hands that knew how to find the fish stayed dry. She kept the bottles on the top shelf where the kids could not reach. Dark brown glass, no labels, each one a different remedy. Herb-infused tonics were the pharmacy of the black rural South, made by women who knew which root settled the stomach, which bark brought down a fever, which leaf eased a cough that would not quit. The recipes ran through sassafras, boneset, yellow root, mullein, and wild cherry bark, steeped in grain alcohol to extract the medicine and preserve the mixture. Every tonic had a story, and every story led back to someone's grandmother who learned it from someone older still. When the Volstead Act banned the sale of alcohol, these tonics became contraband unless prescribed by a doctor, which cost money no sharecropper had. The bottles disappeared from shelves. The knowledge moved to whispered conversations. And when the last woman who could tell Mullen from boneset by touch died, she took 100 cures no drugstore ever sold. If the tonics came from the shelf, the greens came from the ditch, and the ditch belonged to somebody who did not want you there. Pokeweed salad was a spring ritual in black households across the South. The young shoots gathered in March before the plant grew tall and toxic. You had to know when to pick. Too early, and there was nothing. Too late, and it could make you sick. The shoots were boiled 3 times, water drained each round to pull the poison, then sauteed with fatback onion and vinegar until tender and slightly bitter. The dish tasted like the first warm day of the year, but pokeweed grew along fence lines and field edges belonging to white landowners, and as trespassing laws tightened through the 20s, foraging on private land became finable. The Fordham Urban Law Journal documented how these statutes specifically targeted formerly enslaved communities. A woman picking greens from a ditch could be charged the same as a man stealing livestock. The pokeweed still came up every spring. Fewer hands reached for it. The sausage was in the back of the church by 6 in the morning, wrapped in wax paper and stacked in baskets, and everybody knew it was there, but nobody mentioned it out front. Homemade sausage sold at church suppers was one of the most common underground food economies in black communities. Women grinding pork shoulder by hand, seasoning with sage, red pepper, and a pinch of brown sugar, stuffing casings, smoking over hickory, and bringing them to sell at Sunday suppers and Wednesday prayer meetings. The money kept the church open. The sausage kept the congregation fed. But selling food without a commercial license violated health codes expanding through the decade, and church kitchens, serving hundreds of plates, operated entirely outside the regulatory system. These women had been making sausage their whole lives, learned from mothers who learned from theirs. The law did not care about lineage. It cared about permits. the sales moved underground, the baskets got smaller, and eventually the sausage disappeared, replaced by something from a store that tasted like nothing. In the 1920s, in the cane parishes of Louisiana and the coastal lowlands of Georgia, black households still made switch, fermented sugarcane juice that predated every commercial beer on the market. Fresh pressed cane juice poured into a jug, left in a warm place for 3 to 5 days until it bubbled and turned sour sweet with just enough kick to take the edge off a day in the field. Switch tasted like the cane itself, green, mineral, alive, nothing like grain-based beers. The drink had direct roots in the fermented cane beverages of West Africa and the Caribbean, brought to the South by enslaved people who have been cultivating sugarcane for centuries. When Prohibition banned all beer, Switch fell into the same trap as Persimmon beer, not wine, therefore illegal. Cane workers hid their jugs in the fields. The taste of fresh fermented cane, green, buzzing with life, stopped showing up at supper. Most people have never heard the word. The pit was dug the day before, 4 feet deep, lined with river rock, filled with hickory that burned down to coals by midnight. Whole hog barbecue at Juneteenth gatherings was the centerpiece of the largest black celebration in the South, and in the 1920s, it was also the most watched. Jim Crow municipalities monitored large black assemblies with the same suspicion they gave unlicensed saloons. Officers at the edges, fire marshals citing violations, permits denied without explanation. The hog was split, seasoned with salt, pepper, and vinegar mop, laid over coals before dawn, turned every hour, basted until the skin crackled and the meat pulled clean from the bone. The smell traveled for miles. That was the problem. A Juneteenth barbecue announced itself, and in towns where black joy was treated as a threat, the announcement drew attention nobody wanted. Some communities moved to private land. Others cooked smaller, quieter. The pits got shallower. The crowds got thinner. In Gordonsville, Virginia, the train slowed just enough for a hand to reach through the window. Black women stood on the platform with baskets of fried chicken, biscuits, and pies, selling plates to passengers who had no other way to eat on a segregated railroad. They called themselves Waitercarriers, and by the late 1800s, Gordonsville was known as the fried chicken capital of the world. Psyche Williams-Forson documented how these women turned domestic skill into independence. Chicken was their livelihood, not just their supper. But railroad companies began banning vendors from platforms in the early 1900s, and commercial cooking laws tightened through the 20s, requiring permits most waiter carriers could not afford. The baskets left the platforms, the trains stopped slowing down, and a tradition where a black woman could earn her own money with nothing but a skillet and a recipe she held in her hands. That tradition left with the steam. You had to pick the dandelions in the morning before the sun got too high and the petals closed. That was the rule. Dandelion wine was made in black families across the South and the Midwest, wherever the yellow flowers spread across yards, ditches, and empty lots like a crop nobody planted. The petals were steeped in boiling water with lemon, orange peel, and sugar, then left to ferment for weeks in crocks sealed with cheesecloth. The wine came out golden, light, and faintly floral, nothing like the heavy Muscadine or the dark Blackberry. It tasted like spring in a jar. The Volstead Act allowed home fruit wine, but dandelions were flowers, not fruit, and the legal gray area gave agents all the excuse they needed. McGurr's research confirmed that enforcement fell heaviest on black and immigrant households. The crocks moved to root cellars, the picking moved to before dawn, and eventually, The women who made it grew too old to bend down for the flowers, and nobody younger took their place in the yard. Your fingers stayed purple for days. That was how they knew you had been in somebody else's tree. Mulberry preserves were made from fruit that grew everywhere and belonged to nobody until the law said otherwise. The berries dropped from trees along roads and at the edges of white-owned farms, and black families gathered them by the bucketful every June, cooking them down with sugar into something so dark it looked almost black. Spread on a biscuit, it tasted sweet, tart, and deep. But as property law tightened through the 1920s, gleaning, gathering fallen or unclaimed fruit was increasingly prosecuted as trespassing. A woman picking mulberries from a tree that hung over a public road could be charged if the trunk stood on private land. The purple fingers became evidence. The buckets got lighter. He could tell you the weight of a squirrel by the way the branch moved when it jumped. Squirrel dumplings were a cornerstone of rural black cooking in the South. The meat braised in broth with onions, celery, and a bay leaf until it fell off the bone, then thick dumplings dropped into the pot to cook in the steam. The dish was simple, filling, and almost free if you knew how to set a trap line. Trap lines ran along fence rows and tree lines on land that black folk had worked but never owned. And when game wardens began enforcing trespassing laws alongside hunting regulations in the 1920s, the lines became liabilities. A man caught running traps on a white farmer's land faced arrest, and the cost of a hunting license, when it was even offered, exceeded what most people earned in a week. So the trap lines shrank. The dumplings came less often, and the man who could read a branch from 50 yards, he died in a house where nobody cooked squirrel anymore, and the recipe card they found in his drawer was blank because he never needed one. In the 1920s, when real beer vanished from tables, sassafras, root beer filled the gap. Black folk in the South had been making it for generations, digging the roots in early spring, scrubbing the bark, boiling it with sugar and water until the kitchen smelled like something between root and candy. The drink was foamy, sweet, and cold, poured from crocks kept in spring houses or buried in creek banks. During Prohibition, it became a lifeline for communities that had lost access to every other fermented drink. Kids drank it on porches. Adults drank it at church. But sassafras grew on land increasingly restricted by anti-foraging laws. Decades later, the FDA banned saffron, calling it a carcinogen, one final law burying a tradition that had survived everything else. You heard it before you saw it, the pop and hiss of fish hitting hot grease, the scrape of a metal spatula, and underneath it all, a voice calling out plate numbers from a window that was not supposed to be open. Fish fry suppers, funded by ticket sales, were the financial engine of black community life in the 1920s. Churches, lodges, and mutual aid societies sold tickets at a quarter or 50 cents, and the money paid for everything from roof repairs to burial insurance. The fish was battered in cornmeal, seasoned with salt, pepper, and a pinch of cayenne, fried in cast iron until the edges curled and the crust turned copper dark. But charging admission to a gathering violated local ordinances in many Jim Crow municipalities, and the bootleg liquor that often accompanied the fish made every supper a potential raid target. The tickets got quieter, the suppers moved indoors, and that particular sound, grease popping in the dark while someone called your number, it does not exist anywhere anymore. There is a plate your grandmother made that you will never taste again. Not because the recipe is lost, you might still have it written on an index card in handwriting that got shaky toward the end, or saved in the back of a Bible next to the funeral programs. The ingredients are there, the steps are there, but when you make it, something is different. The cornmeal does not smell the way it smelled in her kitchen. The grease does not pop at the same pitch. The seasoning is right, but the taste is wrong, and you cannot figure out why until you realize the missing ingredient was never written down. It was her hands, her humming, the way she tasted from the spoon without breaking stride, the way the kitchen felt when she was in it, warm and certain, like nothing outside those walls could reach you. Every dish in this list was banned by a law, a license, a fence, or a fine. But the real reason they vanished is simpler and worse. The women who made them are gone, and what they held in their hands, in their silence, in the particular way they turned the spoon, was never illegal. It was just irreplaceable. Molasses cake was the closest thing to dessert most enslaved people would taste at Christmas, baked in cast iron skillets over cabin fires. Molasses was the cheapest sweetener, the dark byproduct of sugar refining that plantation owners considered beneath their tables but distributed to quarters. Mixed with cornmeal or rare wheat flour, eggs when available, and gathered spices, the batter baked into dense, moist cake with deep, almost burnt sweetness. The flavor was intense, far removed from delicate cakes served in the big house, but beloved in its own way. Women who made exceptional molasses cake earned reputations spreading across plantations, their recipes guarded and whispered. Children hovered near the fire, watching for signs the cake was ready. Each slice represented weeks of careful hoarding, extra molasses saved, flour hidden away, eggs collected one by one until enough existed to create something truly celebratory from almost nothing.
Candied yams were the crown jewel of every African American Christmas table, their sticky sweetness drawing children and adults alike. Sweet potatoes were peeled and sliced thick, then layered in baking dishes with brown sugar, butter, cinnamon, and nutmeg. As they baked slowly, the sugars caramelized into golden syrup that coated each tender slice. Some mothers added orange juice or crushed pineapple for brightness, while others kept it simple. The dish cost almost nothing since sweet potatoes grew abundantly and stored well through winter. Children would sneak bites before dinner, unable to resist the glistening orange slices that smelled like Christmas itself. Candied yams represented both abundance and thrift, proving holiday luxury needed no expensive ingredients.
Molasses tea cakes were the quiet cornerstone of African American Christmas baking, soft and subtly sweet cookies that carried generations of tradition in every bite. These weren't fancy decorated cookies. They were humble rounds made with molasses, flour, butter, and warm spices like nutmeg and cinnamon that filled kitchens with holiday scent. Grandmothers mixed the dough by feel rather than measurement, knowing exactly when the texture was right from years of practice. The cookies baked until just set, staying soft in the center with edges barely browned. Families served them at church gatherings, packed them in tins for neighbors, and stacked them on plates for Christmas morning. Molasses was affordable when refined sugar wasn't, making these accessible to households stretching every dollar. Children grew up expecting them, associating their earthy sweetness with warmth and celebration. Today, molasses tea cakes have vanished from holiday tables, replaced by elaborate desserts lacking their quiet dignity. Hog jowl and black-eyed peas carry deep meaning for enslaved communities, especially during Christmas when slaveholders sometimes distributed extra pork rations. The jowl was fatty cheek meat, considered undesirable by wealthy families, but treasured in quarters for its rich flavor and ability to season large pots. Black-eyed peas simmered slowly with the jowl until creamy and infused with smoky, salty essence. This combination became associated with luck and prosperity, beliefs enslaved people held fiercely despite their circumstances. One hog jowl could flavor enough peas to feed an entire cabin, stretching limited rations further than seemed possible. Women woke before dawn on Christmas morning to start the pot, knowing it needed hours to reach perfection. The peas were easy to grow and store, making them a reliable staple. This dish was more than sustenance. It was an act of hope, a belief that better days might come despite all evidence to the contrary.
Sweet potato pie held more emotional weight than any other Christmas dessert, its spiced filling representing generations of tradition. Roasted sweet potatoes were mashed smooth with butter, sugar, eggs, and evaporated milk until silky and fragrant with nutmeg. The mixture was poured into homemade pie crusts and baked until the center barely jiggled, achieving perfect texture. Every family had one designated pie maker whose recipe could not be questioned by younger generations. Sweet potato pie appeared at Christmas because ingredients were affordable and potatoes stored well through winter months. Children learned early the pie was not to be touched until after dinner, though many snuck tastes from edges. The dessert proved that simple ingredients created holiday magic.
Chitlins with hot pepper vinegar was a Christmas dish requiring days of preparation and representing the ultimate example of making treasure from what others discarded. Chitlins, cleaned hog intestines, were given to enslaved workers after butchering because white families refused them. The cleaning process was intensive, requiring multiple soakings in cold water. Once cleaned, chitlins boiled for hours until tender, then served with vinegar spiked with hot peppers that cut through the richness. The powerful, distinctive smell filled quarters with an aroma announcing the holiday. Preparing chitlins was communal, with women gathering to clean and cook while sharing stories and songs. The dish carried African roots, connecting enslaved people to foodways their ancestors practiced before the Middle Passage. Eating chitlins at Christmas became an act of cultural preservation, a way of maintaining identity and community bonds that slavery sought to destroy.
Ham-hock collard greens simmered on stovetops throughout Black neighborhoods during Christmas week, their smoky fragrance drifting through windows. Tough collard leaves were stripped from stems, washed repeatedly, then piled into enormous pots with smoked ham hocks for flavor. The greens cooked low and slow for hours, their bitterness mellowing into silky tenderness while absorbing salty, smoky essence. Mothers added vinegar, hot sauce, or sugar depending on family tradition, each household guarding specific seasoning secrets. The potlikker left behind was liquid gold, sipped from cups or soaked up with cornbread. Collard greens cost almost nothing when bought in bunches from markets or picked from backyard gardens lasting into December.
Crackling bread was a Christmas treat that transformed hog butchering scraps into something children waited for all year. When slaveholders slaughtered hogs in December, rendered fat left behind crispy bits of skin called cracklings. These golden, crunchy pieces were mixed into cornmeal batter and baked into bread that snapped with each bite. The bread was dense and satisfying, with pockets of salty, porky flavor throughout the golden crumb. Enslaved families considered crackling bread special because cracklings were only available during winter butchering season. Mothers saved the best pieces, hiding them until enough had been collected for a proper batch. The aroma of crackling, bread baking filled small cabins with warmth and anticipation, signaling the holiday had arrived. This simple bread carried enormous emotional weight, a reminder that even within slavery's brutal system, moments of sweetness could be created from scraps others discarded without thought.
Cornbread dressing was the soul of Christmas dinner. its savory richness anchoring the entire holiday meal in African American homes. Mothers crumbled day-old cornbread into enormous bowls, mixing it with sautéed celery, onions, and sage that perfumed kitchens. Chicken broth moistened the mixture while beaten eggs bound everything together into perfect texture. Some families added giblets or crumbled sausage, depending on regional traditions and budget. The dressing baked until golden on top and custardy inside, its edges crisping into coveted portions. Unlike bread stuffing, cornbread dressing carried distinctly Southern heritage that Black families treasured. It stretched to feed crowds, since cornmeal cost pennies, and transformed into enough for the entire extended family.
30 kitchens went quiet. Not one of them had to. Like, subscribe and tell us which one your grandmother made.